How you doing? Coming to you live or recorded from my back porch. Welcome to Unit 2. We'll look at a couple of important topics in these next two videos. Really, we're going to focus in particular on this idea, one of the words here. When you see this book, The Origin of Species, this was a controversial book written in 1859 by Charles Darwin. And we'll discuss what Darwin said and what Darwin didn't say in his book. This was controversial, it was groundbreaking, and a lot of people find it to be a controversial book for a number of reasons, and we'll address those in class. Many find it controversial because it deals with origins, where we think life came from, where we think we came from, or at least what Darwin said we came from. But the other word there, species, that's not an easy word either in science. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in these next two videos. What is a species? To get to that understanding, we're going to have to understand the word taxonomy. Taxonomy is really the science of classification. Taxonomy is the science of putting things in groupings that make sense. And you see here identification, naming, and classification of organisms. Think of it as how do we organize things. In this case, how do we organize life? How do we put life basically in groups and classifications that make sense? And you'll see why that's an important concept here in a second. Some of the classification can be relatively easy. We can think about types of things, like types of bears. And what will be a little confusing to you perhaps is that all these bears are not necessarily directly related to each other. We can look at something like the big cats, jaguars and cheetahs and lions and tigers, etc. Some of the classification, though, can be relatively easy. We know the difference between bears and big cats. However, some of the classification is not going to be as clear. Here we have the western and eastern meadowlarks. And surprisingly, even though they look very similar, they actually are of different species. So this idea of what a species is can be a little confusing. If we're putting things in groups based upon certain characteristics or features or traits, these two birds look pretty similar. And you would think that they're going to be in the same species or group, when in fact they aren't. So this definition might need some clarification here. When taxonomists, biologists that do classification, classify, it's not based on just superficial similarities. It's not based just in the case of the meadowlarks on yellow and black and similarities. Here's a key point. Scientists want to classify organisms, put them into groups that best demonstrates their evolutionary relatedness. Think about this. If we were to group members of you and your family versus the entire world, we're going to put your family together as a classification group. Even though you may look similar to somebody else superficially, the family, because it's related, we want to put that in a group with itself versus putting it into a group just based on pure similarity or pure or pure features. We want to focus on evolutionary relationships, relatedness, connections based upon evolution. Here's an example of this. Frogs, snakes, lizards, and birds all probably had a common ancestor. But snakes, lizards, and birds, all of these lay eggs. It's called an amniotic egg, and you are very familiar with it. So because the lizards, snakes, and birds all do that, even though they don't look as much alike as you might want to think about putting them into groups, we put them in the same evolutionary branch because they are related. In other words, that egg is an evolutionary connection to all those organisms, and therefore they're more closely related to each other than they are to frogs. So classification is not just based upon features you can see, but it's also based upon evolutionary connections. What connects individuals, what connects groups, that's what we want to use for our classification. So here's our challenge. When we start looking at all the organisms in the world, all the different kinds of things, and we look through all the relationships and all the characteristics and all the evidence, we got to start putting these things into groups, putting these things into categories. And we do that, in fact, we can put everything in the world into three basic buckets. We call these domains. There's a domain for bacteria, domain for archaea, which is an ancient kind of bacteria, and then the domain eukarya, which includes all the eukaryotes. But these terms, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, are going to be not, oops, thought I had a marker, are not going to be as some are familiar to you yet, but we'll get into those a little bit later. But we can put all living organisms in the world into three basic buckets. They're either going to be domain bacteria, domain archaea, or domain eukarya. And we can go further, and you're probably familiar with this classification grouping when we talk about the different ways or kind of the hierarchies of classification. So let's take a tiger. Tigers are kind of fun. And let's look at kind of its groupings. We have the domains, and we just saw domain eukarya. So all tigers, including all other animals, as well as, we have insects here, we have birds, we have plants here. We have a lot of things that are in this group, group eukarya. That's domain. The next group is a little bit narrower. It's the group kingdom. In this case, we're looking at Animalia. And Animalia doesn't include plants, so we're going to take it out. So now we have a little bit smaller category. We go to chordates, which is the phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And ultimately, we're talking about one particular type of organism here, and this is the case. This is going to be the tiger. But think of this kind of in a different way. Let me see if I can draw this. If I said, where do you live? And you said, I live on a place called Earth. I'm like, great. Can you narrow it down for me? Yeah, I live in a place called North America. Okay, well, okay, and here's my little sketch of North America. Okay, you live in North America. Well, where do you live in North America? Well, I live in North Carolina. Well, now we're talking about here. Well, I'll actually live in a place called Sanford. Now we're talking about there. And we can go more and more and more specific until they get down to one particular house on one particular street, in one particular town, of one particular county, of one particular state, and that's where you live. In the same way, it's like going from Earth to North America to North Carolina to Lee County to Sanford and so forth, all the way down to a particular house. So we have this grouping called, it's called a hierarchy going from domains, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, all the way till we get to one particular type of organism. In this case, it's Panthera tigris. We, you probably heard of our group, we are Homo sapiens. Okay, that's our particular group, our particular species. Now, even having this conversation doesn't necessarily tell you what a species yet, but think of a species as a rather unique type. This is the only type that's like this. Okay, so what are we saying? We're saying that we can start with hierarchy, and to this progression, we can work our way down to smaller and smaller categories. So the hierarchy ends with the species name. I covered it up. Panthera tigris is a particular group, and ultimately we're down to this two name, kind of a first and last name, if you will. It's called a binomial name because it's two, and this is the scientific name of an organism. Just like I mentioned, we're Homo sapiens, tigers are Panthera tigris, some trees are Quercus rubra, some are Quercus alba, that's red and white oaks respectively. So we can get down to a particular type. So for now, keep that in mind as your discussion of species. What is a species? We'll deal with it more in the next video, but it's a very, very particular type. So when Darwin said the origin of species, he was trying to explain, why do you look around and see all of these different types of organisms? He advanced an idea for how these species all came about. We'll refine our definition of a species in the next video. Stay tuned.